So this is the third class in, I guess, what we could call a sort of crash course in the philosophy of psychology. So looking at some of the philosophical assumptions and theoretical ambiguities that might play into our trying to make sense of or understand human personality. So we began with a no-nonsense definition of personality, suggesting that it could be conceived as an attempt to explain relatively stable or predictable patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting as it manifests within a given individual over time. So that's a good starting point. They're good enough for now. And then we talked about three different modes of investigation or three different ways that we can try to make a knowledge claim or try to understand some phenomena. We talked about empiricism, which I think is quite familiar to you guys, rationalism, and briefly phenomenology. And so we're hoping to maybe combine all three, or depending on the context, depending on what we're trying to do, we might emphasize one over the other. The last class was a deeper exploration into our understanding of causation, like what is a causal explanation, what makes something what it is, what accounts for it. And we broke down the four different causes that you really want to commit to memory: the material, efficient, formal, and final cause. Material and efficient cause, as we talked about, kind of hang together, they go together, and formal, final cause go together in a way too. So just to, again, to just drill this into your head, some of the terms that might kind of line up with those different causes. So when you think about material cause, you want to think about its material, its substance, matter, physical stuff, occurrent objects over there, so to speak. Efficient cause has to do with motion, movement, change, force, action, happening, eventing, momentum, continuous, contiguous relation states between entities. Formal cause involves its patterning, its form, its sociocultural framing. It has to do with a referential totality. It's the basis of intelligibility, what allows something to show up as intelligible in some way. It involves a totality of significance, meanings, abstractions, familiarity, background practices, possibilities of use, its symbolic structure, and intersubjective understanding within a conceptual community, and so on. Final cause, you might think of reason, purpose, goal, aims, ends, intentions, desires, wishes, motives, hopes, affirming a meaning or a ground, and so on. So are you with me on this? Okay, so I just thought I'd give another example that doesn't have to do with a hammer, but has to do with involving more explicitly or concretely, rather, a person. So the silly example that I came up with that we can kind of work around is if in the midst of our class here we're talking and someone picks up a textbook and they throw it at the wall. They throw it over here, right? And so we're trying to explain this particular phenomenon, right? And so if we try to account for the material cause of what's going on there, what kinds of things would we list off? So let's start with the book. And how do we break the book down into its material cause?
Paper, and if it's a hard copy, maybe cardboard?
Yeah, so there's paper, there's maybe cardboard, there's what else it goes into a book? Ink.
Whatever, like
the binding, glue, all that kind of stuff. So there's the book, there's the human being, and how do we break them down to a material cause?
Bones and skin, blood.
There's bones and skin, blood and guts and muscles and, you know, neurons and cells, like all that kind of stuff, right? So we'll say all that kind of stuff, and it's hitting a wall, right? So how we account for the wall in its material cause.
Drywall or
What's that? Drywall or brick or concrete or whatever, paint, you know, this sort of thing. Now we go to the efficient cause, so just the concrete events as they might be understood extrospectively. How do we, what kinds of things would we list, the processes involved in that? Just the unfolding of happenings, let's say. What would we say? So again, a person's sitting here and they just seem to pick up a book and throw it at the wall. Well, let's leave out the deciding part. Well, isn't this interesting, right? So we immediately slide into, what is this person's intention, purpose? There's a deciding, this sort of thing. That's not part of efficient cause, though. Efficient cause is that you're looking at just, if you were to look at this whatever this is, as just a thing or a process or just an unfolding of just movement, right? Like, how would we understand it? If you were like a really dense physicist or scientist or something, and you were just trying to understand this, how would you go about it? Yeah.
Start with like the neurons and action potential,
Yeah.
and then the muscle movement.
You talk about action potentials, muscle contractions. You'd talk about like the motor cortex and premotor cortex. You'd talk about, well, I have a list of things here. You'd talk about the finger grip, arm movement, muscle contraction, release, the loosened grip, the energy, entropy, forces, acceleration, velocity, gravity, mass, wind resist. Like, you could talk about all that stuff, and all that fits within just efficient cause, right? You with me on that? Now, so material efficient cause, if you were to just try to understand some phenomena as again, a very dense physicist or chemist or biologist, that's roughly how you would do it in this instance, right? You're just trying to understand it as a series of events, independent of any person that might have a particular perspective on those events, okay? Now, when we jump to formal cause, right? And yeah, so what goes into the formal cause understanding, the framing or the understanding of what's happening here? Like, what else would go into that?
So would you be like, you might recognize like their facial expression as something indicative of what they're trying to do?
Yeah, well, you're on the right track. You're on the right track. So well, we might get into that. So we might kind of look at this person engaging in this thing, and we might have some kind of formal cause understanding of what the facial expression means or entails or involves or something like that. Yep.
Does the context count?
Big time. The context absolutely counts, yeah. So what will we say about the context here in terms of our understanding of the context of this unfolding?
Like, it's unusual for a person just to throw a book.
Right, yeah. This is unusual. This is not something that someone does in this context. Why? Because we have this sort of background, basic understanding of what one does in a classroom. So there's this basic, intuitive sense of what classrooms are for, right? They're arguably for learning, not for throwing books, right? Now, if this person happened to be in, the mid-30s Nazi Germany and, happened to launch this book into a burning pile of other books, well, that may not be rational, but it's certainly intelligible within that context, right? But in this context, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, or at least we recognize it as not making a whole lot of sense. Yeah. What else plays into the formal cause, do you think? It's kind of tricky, but I'm just going to run through some things. So the space that we're in, that this individual's in, that the observers are in, is sort of implicitly understood as a classroom with familiar purposes and possibilities. The object is tacitly perceived as a book, as opposed to like a water balloon or a brick or something like that. So there's this intuitive understanding of what this object is. And it's understood as I think, let's say in this case, intentionally thrown as opposed to flying of its own accord or something like that. So there's this understanding of that. There's, again, I think we're kind of hinting at here, there's an implicit kind of rule violation, right? So rules are part of formal cause, and the implicit rule is that one does not do this sort of thing in a classroom, and there's a violation of that rule. And all that is part of formal cause. Now, when we get to final cause, now we can more clearly get into the first person kind of experiencer and how they're framing their situation and why they're doing it. Yeah.
So formal is more to do with like people's like understanding of like you can say like understanding something is part of the formal.
Yeah, and understanding in a very broad sense. There are different kind of levels of understanding. There's, as we'll kind of get into, there's like an implicit sort of procedural kind of intuitive understanding, and then there's an explicit, something we could articulate, right?
Would it be like the first, the material cause, efficient cause, formal cause, those are kind of like third person perspective because you're kind of like looking at it from the outside?
The material efficient cause would be more that third person, yeah. Yeah. So what would we say for what would we guess if we had to guess or speculate, or what might we expect to get from this person if we were to ask them, like, why did you do this? What was this about? What kinds of things would we get?
Perhaps they were like stressed out, or just something where they were like overloaded with work, and this was a way of like sort of expressing that.
Right. So they might be like, I can't handle this, and they throw it or something, or they're thinking that thought, and it's just a sort of nervous breakdown of sorts. Yeah. What else?
Maybe the prof said something that agitated them, or said something else.
Yeah. So maybe the professor said something that really upset them, like, to hell with this, and they throw the book and they're expressing their outrage, right? Any other thoughts or examples? I mean, that's pretty much it, right? Like, so what is the goal or purpose, or what is this about for you? This sort of thing. That's what we have in mind with final cause. Does that make sense? You guys with me on that? Okay. So we're going to just walk through two different sort of, this is from the Reichlach reading, this is the last thing we'll kind of cover on that point, but two different models or frameworks that kind of overlap with some of the things that we're talking about here. So again, an extrospective mode of theorizing is taking up more of a third-person observer type way of theorizing. It's going to more heavily bias toward material-efficient causal explanations, whereas an introspective mode of theorizing recognizes that no, there's this subjectivity that we have to account for, and then there's also an intersubjective way of being within the world, so to speak, with people and alongside other kind of entities and background practices and all that, and that has to be accounted for within the formal and final cause. So the Lockean model and the Kantian model, I know you probably can't see that at the bottom, I apologize, but they roughly kind of fall on one or the other side of this spectrum. So the Lockean model is coming more from an empirical tradition, again, a third-person empiricism of the tradition of Bacon, Hobbes, Newton, Berkeley, Hume, these folks. It has heavily realist leanings. The idea is that our theoretical construct can be derived from a mind-independent, objective reality. So this is what they have in mind when they talk about objectivity, that there's objects out there in the world that we're going to try to understand as if they're sort of self-sufficient or they can be explained independent of any particular interpretive frame. It emphasizes demonstrative ideas and meanings. Demonstrative in the sense that they're clear, direct, they're unipolar in their definition. So when you think of demonstrative ideas, you can think about like a very straightforward, no-nonsense dictionary definition that effectively points to some other entity or object or process in the world. The absolute best, demonstrative mode of explaining is to be able to point to something and say that, or not even say that, because that's a conceptual kind of, interpretive something or other, but to point to something and that be the thing that you're indicating. So it's very clearly defined. And so the notion is that ideas should be based on what is clearly observable and quotes what is scientifically proven. Now all of this depends, of course, on your definition of science, how narrowly or how broadly you consider that. So there's a material efficient causal emphasis. It denies telic explanations. Again, telos means toward an end or purpose or goal. So it denies final cause and is thus reductionist. So the ultimate understanding or explanation or account of something should break it down to its constituent parts. So if you were a hardline sort of empiricist working from this sort of Lockean frame, you would say that when our science is properly mature, then we'll be able to get rid of all this psychological theorizing and we'll be able to explain human beings entirely by studying their neurochemistry or neurobiology and the interactions between nervous systems and so on. So that is the sort of belief from this framework. Yeah.
Kind of like just nothing is subjective,
Everything is absolutely concrete, and yeah. So that is the emphasis, or if you were to take that to its extreme conclusion, that's kind of what you would end up with. So biology reduces to chemistry, chemistry reduces to physics, and so on. The Kantian model, in contrast, is coming more from a continental tradition as opposed to, there's a philosophical tradition as opposed to an analytical philosophical tradition. So you can just think in terms of, it tends to emphasize phenomenology and our understanding of ourselves as already being instantiated within a world of some sort. In other words, that you're already in the world in some way while you're trying to engage in this active interpretation of your situation and the situation around you. So it's idealist or critical realist in its leanings, that theoretical constructs and meanings are created by persons that are mind-dependent. So note that Kant was an epistemological idealist, not an ontological idealist. So what that means is that it's essentially the recognition that everything that can be known is known by someone or by people, by human beings. The idea is that if there is a world independent of people, we can't know it. And he took it on faith that it existed, right? Well, it's only logical that it exists in some way. And he referred to that as the noumenal world. But he said that we can't engage with it directly because we're always interpreting through our sense perception, the biological apparatus that we have. And also, we're already in the business of interpreting along the lines of our sociocultural understandings. Heidegger referred to this as being thrown into the world, and we discover ourselves in time as we emerge into an independent subjectivity, but that's all grounded in a prior way of being in the world. So it's also able to include or account for dialectical ideas and meanings based on conceptual interconnectedness. So this means that, for example, to have any vague intuitive sense of what it means to say up, you have to understand down. To make sense of left, you have to understand right. To understand good, you have to have some sense of bad. To have a sense of morality, you have to have a sense of immorality, right? So there's this conceptual interconnectedness. So it's bipolar, not in the diagnostic sense, but in the conceptual sense, in its understanding of meanings. And the idea is that rational understanding must be employed to gain knowledge, even that derived from observation. There's an emphasis, or at least it accounts for human teleology, that there is, phenomena such as goals and intentions, beliefs, decisions, and things of that nature. It's able to account for that within this model. And the idea is that the ultimate given in meaning, that is where analysis ends, it's not at the very bottom of some kind of material efficient mechanistic unfolding. It's actually part of that interpretive frame that we bring to bear on our situation. So it's all entangled within that. Now, a fun question to ask, in a way, is when we look at I guess the other thing I really want to emphasize is when we talk about material efficient formal final causes, as it relates to human beings, all of these causes are arguably simultaneous, right? So you are never in the world, in a way, independent of material efficient causes, right? So again, we're not putting forth like a dualist kind of hypothesis. Dualism is actually interesting, Cartesian dualism, right? But there's two kinds of dualisms, and many people, who haven't read a lot of, continental philosophy or phenomenology, it may not occur to you, but when we think of Cartesian dualism, we think of, someone who's putting forth a theory that posits that there's a self-sufficient mind independent of a body, right? Something like that. And as budding philosophers, we get great glee and joy in accusing someone of engaging in some form of Cartesian dualism in that sense, right? But there's another kind of dualism, and it's the dualism of there being a separation between person and world, that there's a mind independent of a world. And instead, I think what we want to appreciate is that anything that you're doing, any kind of interpretive act, you are always already in a world. You are instantiated within a way of being. Like even thinking, right? Well, where did those thoughts come from? Well, those thoughts came from your ability to use language. Well, where is language? Language is within this intersubjective community within which we are embedded, right? And so when you engage in a process of thinking, you're having a conversation, but it's only with one person, right? And you've learned how to do that through this way of being in the world. So we want to, again, like it's almost like a understanding the notion of world in a different way. When we think of world, it's not just like this noumenal kind of mind-independent thing over there, right? If we want to view it in that way, we put world in scare quotes, to emphasize that there's a difference between that notion of world that we can never understand and the kind of world that we inhabit and dwell within. So the paper that I had you guys read, it can be kind of summarized in this way. I was just talking about it with a student just before class. But there's just a little quote here that kind of summarizes, I think, in a way what the paper was trying to do. It's saying, by and large, psychology has not kept track of the conceptual advances within physics. And so when psychology first, the argument is that when psychology first emerged, it emerged before quantum mechanics, before Einstein's theory of relativity, and it was operating more on a Newtonian conception of physics or material efficient causality. And the argument here is that we've gotten stuck in that way of conceptualizing people and the object of our inquiry. And so we haven't kept up with some of the advancements in mainstream physics, assuming that human beings could be understood from that same kind of causal framework. And I think there's reason to think that that's not the case. And it's failed to keep up with advancements within the philosophy of science as well. Being able to take on some of the arguments by Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper and how that applies to what we're trying to do. And has maintained its own folk science grounded in outdated Newtonian concepts for both its theorizing and its methods. So that's the thrust of the argument in the paper. And again, this is the last of 3 classes, and it's all it's trying to do is say, look, we've been in the business of trying to make sense of people primarily from a causal framework that emphasizes material efficient causes. Is that sufficient, for our purposes, or might we need to, put forward another model of causation that will help us have an accurate grasp of the kind of being that we are, and trying to understand why we do what we do? Does that make sense? Are we able to see, with the advancement of our methods and scientific practices, what's going on in the mind using a neuroscientific approach? That's the question. Now, it's interesting that, some of the assumptions in just how you kind of put that out there. When we say in the mind, right? That's interesting, because we're making some assumptions when we frame it that way, aren't we? So we say that the mind is located in space when we say that, right? And that there's an inner and presumably an outer, right? And that the mind is in, presumably, the nervous system or something like that. And I don't know if we're, I don't think that we're justified in holding that belief. So if we take a broader understanding of what we mean by world, and again, just even like, well, where are thoughts? I mean, we can get into a big philosophical discussion about that, but again, I think part of what it is to be a person is to be worlded in a way, and to be dwelling within a conceptual community. And I think we maybe need to, we'll get into some of this stuff when we get into the Heideggerian stuff, But the short answer to that question is no, I don't think that we can do that. Yeah. Sort of, when we talk about meaning and intention and how it resists, dissolving it into material efficient causes, right? Meaning, and these are slippery terms, by the way, right? And they're slippery in part because they kind of change with our use and our practices and things of that nature. But I was thinking about this last night, and I was kind of thinking about meaning. And just to give an example of this, we can talk about meaning as a kind of a basic understanding through use or through expression within an appropriate context. So in other words, you understand the meaning of a door by walking up the front steps of the university and opening and moving through it, right? So there's a sense in which you grasp the meaning of this entity or thing or whatever in that sense. Now, what's fun to kind of consider or think about, this is kind of where my head went with it last night, is that if you were going in through the door and you bumped into someone going out the door and you said, sorry, right, which is what we Canadians often do, right? We have an intuitive understanding of what we mean when we say sorry, right? And it's something along the lines in that context, at least if you're Canadian, right? It's kind of mind-boggling to someone who's not Canadian, right? But to anyone who's Canadian, you have some intuitive understanding. Well, it means something to the effect of, it wasn't my intention to run into you, right? And so meaning kind of ties in with intention in a way like that. So there's that sense of meaning, right, or that how it ties in with intention. But then there's a sense of meaning as it relates to a reference or a dictionary definition. So when someone says, really, did you really mean to say sorry? Like, are you acknowledging that you were at fault in this exchange just now and that you're apologizing for it? I think if someone was to point that out, I think most of us in some of the situations that we find ourselves in, we would say, well, no, I wasn't really acknowledging, actually, you were the clumsy one out of the two of us. I'm not, if anyone should apologize, it should be you. But I did say sorry, so that wasn't exactly what I meant. But I didn't mean to bump into you either, right? So there's this kind of complicated, weird stuff in what it is to be human. And then there's arguably a third or fourth level of meaning, and I'm going to break away from this example, but meaning as it applies to, or as it involves that which is meaningful, that which matters to me. And in other words, that there are various possibilities that are available to me as a human being, various ways of being in the world. And I choose one way of being over another way of being. And it bears on how I view myself or how I see myself as a person and how I want to be seen, right? And so that's another kind of, sense of meaning. Confusing, interesting, kind of weird. Yeah. But what's interesting, like all those kinds of meanings, they seem to be bound up in this formal final cause phenomena and arguably aren't able to be neatly reduced to a material efficient causal analysis. Anyway, we'll get greater clarity on some of this as we move along. But for the rest of the lecture, I want to just talk about conceptual communities in more detail, and we'll just have a sense of, so when we're looking at these different paradigms of personality theorizing, what does it entail? How do people get into this particular mode of theorizing, and what's it all about, and how do we understand what's going on there? So one way of coming at it is, this is sort of a Kuhnian sort of way of coming at it. And we'll frame it as an imperfect empiricism. So to whatever extent we believe that we can engage in an empiricism, we have to acknowledge in some sense that it's imperfect, it's less than perfect. And we can run into problems when we take ourselves too seriously or de-emphasize the importance of theory. So there's a quote here, the empiricist thinks he believes only what he sees, but he is much better at believing than seeing. So following Kuhn, Spencer argues that there's a gap between the actual practice of social science as imperfect empiricism and the stated practice as scientific empiricism. Now, Kuhn and Popper and the whole philosophy of science, like they're mostly interested, or they're looking at, the evolution over time of theories, as it pertains to biology and chemistry and physics and so on. What we're doing is, again, arguably far more complicated and tricky, and so the problems that exist for the natural sciences, quote unquote, are going to be doubly so for us, for all the reasons that we talked about in the previous classes. So you want to keep that in mind. Now, the story goes something like this. If someone says, well, what is science? Well, the hard-nosed empiricist that hasn't given much critical thought into what they're doing kind of lays it out something like this: that there's scientific knowledge that involves a dialectic between hypothesis and data, that hypotheses are developed from observational and experimental data. So just observations that are very clearly demarcated, that are there just to take up and interpret. They're tested through further observation and experimentation. Scientific beliefs are grounded in objective data and are always tentative and may be refuted. So this sounds like a wonderful story. It sounds quite nice, but it may not describe how science really works in practice. And Kuhn had demonstrated that that is not at all how science works in practice, even the hard sciences. So Kuhn described science as a puzzle-solving activity in which the paradigm that organizes scientific knowledge is taken for granted and treated more or less as true. So there are background assumptions or attitudes or beliefs as it pertains to a given ontology, what kinds of entities exist in the world, how they interact with other entities or objects. Like all these things are part of the background belief structure of anyone dwelling within a given conceptual community or paradigm. And these things are more or less, taken on as true. And arguably, well, to a certain extent, but by necessity. We'll get into that maybe in a minute. But here's a quote by Thomas Kuhn. Effective research scarcely begins before a scientific community thinks it has acquired firm answers to questions like the following. What are the fundamental entities of which the universe is composed? That's an ontological question. How do these interact with each other and with the senses? That's arguably a causal question. And what questions may be legitimately asked about such entities and what techniques employed in seeking solutions? So every paradigm has arguably already settled these questions. They already have an intuitive understanding of what the right answer is to these kinds of questions. I don't know if this has changed. There's some students in the class, I think, that are currently, doing a minor in philosophy, or if they've taken some philosophy courses. What is the attitude that most philosophers nowadays have toward metaphysics? Does anyone have an intuitive? It's negative, right? So anyone who's engaging in metaphysical exploration, we view them as what?
It's like a indulgence almost. It's not like a practical thing.
It's not.
Going anywhere. It's for solipsism.
Right. But, which is interesting. So, yeah, there's this kind of like tendency to kind of poo-poo on metaphysics and that's not, real rigorous, inquiry and so on. But part of metaphysics is ontology, right? The understanding of what is. If you're going to engage in some inquiry into some subject or some entity, you should have some understanding of what, I should think about, well, what kind of entity is it? What's the ontological status of this entity that I'm exploring? So we gloss over those questions in philosophy. We gloss over those questions, or at least nowadays it's kind of frowned upon. And then the causal questions, that's part of metaphysics as well, right? So arguably, good psychological science involves doing some metaphysics, right? We need to get clear on some of those assumptions before we engage in our research. I was going to say, I don't think I've mentioned this, but when we talk about, I guess, one of the things is that if you're walking away from this class, and if you walked into the class thinking like, well, yes, of course, psychology should be an empirical science, my hope is that, at the end of actually these first few lectures, my hope is that you're now thinking, well, what do we mean by empiricism anyway, right? Like, my hope is that you guys might, what's interesting is that when we talk about, the empirical data, the empirical, I'm going to engage in some empirical science as it relates to psychology. Well, really, don't we mean kind of experimental? Is that not what we mean? And is empiricism and running an experiment, is that the same thing? Or is it not the case that we're doing a kind of pseudo-empiricism, right? Well, why is that? Well, because we're doing like survey data and stuff like, things like that. We're not like directly, kind of engaging with some physical entity or process or something like that. And I say pseudo-empiricism not in a dismissive way, just as a way to remind ourselves that, well, there's the rational kind of theoretical component that goes into that as well, to try to fill in the gaps. So anyway, the tentative theory that was supposed to offer a construct or a heuristic becomes reality through our tacit assumptions, our background beliefs, our intuitive practices, the meanings that we take up, the goals within that conceptual community, and so on. Again, a useful set of ideas or concepts to wrap your head around is implicit knowledge, a knowing how versus an explicit knowing that. So implicit knowledge is, again, that sort of background intuitive, what you can know without necessarily being able to say it, right? And just a common example of that, I'm sure some of you are musicians, you play instruments and things like that. Suppose you play guitar and you're hanging out with someone else who's just learning how to play guitar, and they say to you, they're holding their guitar and they say to you, do you know how to play Stairway to Heaven? And you say, well, gosh, it's been a long time since I've played it. Well, just tell me the first note, tell me the first chord. And you say, well, I don't think I can tell you, I'm not sure. But do you know how to play it? I don't know, let's see, hand me the guitar. And when you have the guitar in your hands and you're attending to, like, you know the song, you know how it's supposed to sound, and then you're attending to the goal of producing that sound, and your hand just naturally goes where it needs to go. There's a familiar kind of intuitive understanding of how to play this thing. Another example is, sometimes, like, if someone was to ask you, like, well, hey, let's kind of go over to a friend's house and we'll watch Netflix, or we'll do this or that. What's your Netflix password? I don't have Netflix. And you say, like, oh gosh, I don't know if I remember my password. Well, are we able to watch it? I don't know. Sit me in front of the laptop and I'll just see. And so the context kind of prompts your body to kind of respond in a way. So you're able to demonstrate that you know your password, but not in an explicit way. Yeah. Yeah.
Because, like, remembering how to play guitar after not playing it for a while, a lot of that is muscle memory.
Yep.
Just remembering how to do that.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about muscle memory, but I guess I would. So it's interesting. So we can talk about muscle memory in different ways, can't we? Right? We can talk about muscle memory in a material efficient sense, right? Well, all it is action potentials, neurons that fire together, wire together, and increased probabilities of this and that and the other thing. That's a third person kind of way of understanding it and trying to reduce it to that. There's another way of kind of considering muscle memory or bodily memory, and it's more of a phenomenological kind of a familiar way of being in the world. And the situation, there's a formal cause understanding here, right? Because the situation is such that there's this background understanding or prompting that you're in your body and you're engaging in such a way that it sort of prompts this response. I don't think that we're able to, maybe you could, if you wanted to, you might be able to do some of that, but I think there are situations like what it is to know a melody, to hear a melody, to frame that sort of thing. I think you're going to have to get into formal causality with that. Was there another question? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not really like a procedural thing, kind of, per se, because you could say that the reason you're not able to articulate which chord it is or what your password is because So like deeply ingrained into your procedural memory, you can't really say it in words.
Yeah, but yes. So we can talk about muscle memory, procedural memory, tacit understanding, background, intuitive being in the world or whatever. I think we maybe, unless there's a specific instance that we want to dissect and tear apart in excruciating detail, I think we want to be a little bit ambiguous about whether that is going to be reducible to. I don't think you can, right? I mean, even. So let's kind of do a timeout and ask this. This is a really fun question to ask. So of the four causes, material efficient cause, formal final cause, which of the causes is most basic, most fundamental, if we attempt to answer that question?
Material. Material.
So someone says material cause is the most basic, the most fundamental. Would others be inclined to agree?
I would say four.
Right. So someone's suggesting final cause, perhaps, that there has to be some intention or goal or like.
Like without the initial thought or idea, you
right.
wouldn't make.
And the ideas are within the realm of formal cause as well, I would say.
Yeah.
Right? Again, they hang together.
Stems from like an idea, basically.
Right?
What was the question?
Which, so of the four causes, which of the causes are most basic, most fundamental? Well, trees arguably don't have final cause, I don't think. Trees, we wouldn't say trees have aims and purposes and goals and things like that. Yeah.
You're asking, or what you're asking, and what you're talking about.
Yeah, good. So the answer to that question, I think, as best as I can tell, is it depends on which way you look at it, right? So you can look, so if you're looking at like, well, in terms of, the creation of the universe or how the universe unfolded in, and the emergence of, living organisms, the emergence of consciousness and eventually self-consciousness and so on. Well, I think logically, rationally, it only makes sense that material efficient causality was first. It was prior, right? So in the phylogenetic sense, the evolution of our species and so on, material efficient causation must have come first, right? But what's interesting about that, now what's funny about what I'm doing here right now, like if you were to really problematize what I'm doing right now, how would you do it? I think you were on the right track with that. What am I doing right now? When
Making a final cause.
Well,
Or like you're making a formal final cause out of the material.
In order to make my argument, I'm making it within the frame of a formal cause understanding of these different concepts and abstractions and, for the purpose of our joint understanding, this sort of thing. So there is a sense in which material efficient cause, as the unfolding of, the universe from the Big Bang to now, obviously material efficient cause must have come first, but there's another sense in which we can only get to that point through formal cause and final cause. And so in a sense, even our engaging in science involves first being in the world in a way that can make sense of formal final cause, right? It's a real kind of like, whoa, like if you can wrap your head around that. So they're both right in a way, depending on which way you look at it.
So I just had a question, like going back to your thing on like the tree and how it doesn't really have that final cause because it's not really like thinking of it, there's not really any intentions to it.
Right.
I would say that like some people would place a final cause on that. So like the intention of a tree is to provide oxygen for those around it. What would that be what would that be if like the object doesn't have an intention, but a person, like a human person is putting an intention on that object?
Right. Well, that's what Aristotle had originally done when he was initially theorizing about the four causes. And that's why people just eventually said, oh, this is nonsense, this doesn't make any sense. Trees don't have goals and intentions. You can explain that just in terms of... So what is that? I guess someone who is just indulging in anthropomorphizing, non-human entities like trees. I don't know if I'd say much more about it than that.
Now we're just indulging in it.
Right. Well, what's interesting, I don't want to linger too much more because we've got some slides to get through, but I mean, if you guys are with me on some of this, like wow, I'm impressed, because this is really hard stuff to kind of wrap your head around. But one way of looking at it is, in order for us to get to material efficient causality, this is the way that Heidegger would put it, we strip the world of its worldhood, right, is how he would phrase it. We strip the world of any human imbued sense of meaning and purpose and whatever, and once we kind of, take all that stuff off, then what we're left with is material efficient causation. And it's been, I don't think I need to remind anyone, doing that and working within that frame it's led to so many technological advancements and the advancement of civilization. It's not something we want to throw away, of course. That's not at all what we're arguing. We're arguing that once we turn the investigative lens on ourselves, then we want to just remember, in a way, to remind ourselves that there's a different way that we exist in the world. Anyway, okay, so moving along. This is just emphasizing again that tacit knowing or tacit knowledge. To interiorize a theory, for example, is to identify ourselves with the teachings in question by making them function as the proximal term of tacit knowledge as it applies in practice. We can trace this kind of indwelling to logically similar acts in the practice of science. To rely on a theory for understanding nature is to interiorize that theory, for we are tending from the theory to the things seen in its light. So we have this intuitive sense of how to, what is meaningful, what is worth attending to, what we're going to account for, and how we interpret that. We internalize that theory, and it allows us to see, in a way, what we see. So two groups of scientists viewing the world from different paradigms may see different things. They have different interpretations of the evidence, and the data cannot be objective. Or if it's objective in a relative sense. Just an example of this. I read and then responded to an online kind of article on the nature of mental illnesses. If anyone's curious, on the Cornerstone website, there's an essay that I'd written. I don't know if anyone has read it, but someone had made this argument that, well, the history of the therapies that we've developed have been such that, someone working within like a cognitive behavioral kind of way of theorizing, they kind of see something in a way that's different from someone working from a different model. And so our understanding of mental illnesses were not objective, and therefore in order to obtain that objectivity, we then developed the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders so that we would all have the same thing that we're referring to, and we're able to achieve that objectivity. Now, that sounds like that's the textbook or mainstream kind of interpretation of what is happening there. But when I look at it, it's like, no, there is a kind of objectivity to, well, first of all, many people may not know this, but the DSM, if someone meets criteria for a particular diagnosis, it doesn't tell you much of anything, at least for the mainstream diagnoses, anxiety, depression, and things of that nature. It doesn't tell you anything about the causal structure of that phenomena for this particular person. And mental illness categories can be like highly, heterogeneous kind of phenomena. So, two people who have the same diagnosis of major depressive disorder can present in very, very different ways, and arguably the causal structure of what's going on, are very different. So the DSM, the diagnosis itself, doesn't really do much of anything in terms of pointing toward a particular treatment plan. And this is one of the reasons why I don't use the DSM. So are the other ways of theorizing, are they unobjective? Do they not have objectivity? No, they do have objectivity, but only for the persons working within that particular conceptual community. So if you have a room full of cognitive behavioral therapists, and they interview, or they watch someone interview a patient who is struggling with anxiety or depression, they will all likely see more or less the same thing because they're working within that frame. Now, if you have another group who are working within the framework of, a contemporary psychoanalytic or short-term dynamic theory, they will see it differently. They will interpret differently. Does it mean that's not objective? No, it's objective, but it's only relative to that intersubjective community that you're working within. So when I work, I try to, as best I can, I don't know how good I am at doing it, but I try to, see like a particular theory, like does it apply in this context? Is it appropriate to the way that I might work with this person? Or is it better for me to try to conceptualize it using a different theory that has a bit of a different causal assumptive ground, So we'll talk about some of that later, but that's just on this objectivity bit. So on paradigms or conceptual communities, a little bit further, Oscar Wilde's quote, "Professor's ignorance is the result of long study." I like that quote, and essentially what it means is that when you are immersed within a particular conceptual community, what happens is that you tend to get stuck in that mode of thinking. You tend to get stuck into that way of understanding the world or a particular phenomena, and it's self-reinforcing, I guess one thing to point out is, and this is just to emphasize the way in which our theories are, kind of tied, tethered to all kinds of different assumptions that we may not notice. So we thought that our empirical science, or some believe, that we can test individual hypotheses in isolation, so it's always grounded in objective data. But the Duhem-Quine thesis, which was, a real devastating blow to what was, logical positivism, this idea that we can, get, really clear on, what is empirically verifiable, and everything else is just a matter of definition. The Duhem-Quine thesis kind of challenged a lot of that, and it says that it's impossible to empirically test a scientific hypothesis in isolation because it depends on a nested web of ideas, assumptions, auxiliary assumptions or hypotheses that are presupposed and implicitly operating in the background. So just as an example, evolutionary psychology, which is a theory that I've engaged with, kind of years ago, but if you are working within that paradigm or that framework, you intuitively take on, certain understandings. Not all of these understandings, but there's a lot of overlap and they kind of hang together. So for example, if you are an evolutionary psychologist in the mainstream, you're likely very familiar with Tinbergen's 4 questions or causes, Mayer's proximate versus ultimate distinction. You'll have a sense of the mind being modular in composition. You're borrowing some of the terms from cognitive psychology, a lot of these things. So they all kind of hang together. And the idea is that you can't test any one of these things necessarily in isolation because of the interconnectedness. So it's impossible to single out a hypothesis. Each one and its assumptions are tested as a whole, or at least parts of a whole that nonetheless kind of hang together with other assumptions. So scientific facts are always theory dependent. And some of this we talked about before, but it's connected to a logical error common in the social sciences, arguably, called affirming the consequent. We mentioned this before. If my theory is correct, then the research method will give me experimental findings A, B, and C. The findings of my experiment are A, B, and C, therefore my theory is correct. So the strength of the above conclusion will depend in part on the strength of the various assumptions and arguments implied in the theory, or to put it somewhat crudely, garbage in, garbage out. So we want to make sure that our theories are, again, as coherent as we can make them, that they're, based on a reasonable understanding of ontology and causality and so on. Because if we don't do that, then again, we're going to make interpretations, or we're going to understand the phenomena in a way that is arguably a misunderstanding. So Kuhn had pointed out that science itself tends toward dogmatism. It's self-reinforcing, so we tend to be indoctrinated into scientific cultures or conceptual communities by the books and journals we read, the classes we take, the jargon that we're exposed to and learn to use, the professors we encounter and their preferred theories and ideas, and so on. So usually when you kind of sit down with a psychologist and you listen to them talk for a half an hour, based on like the terms that they use, you can kind of get a sense of what framework they're working within. And then when we publish, of course, we publish in our preferred journals, and the editors and the reviewers of our manuscripts are kind of working within the same paradigm, so they're looking for us to use the terms that you're supposed to use within that framework and so on. And it becomes somewhat dogmatic. So students learn to work within a paradigm by internalizing specific practices. Kuhn compared mainstream science to the practice of handing out tourist brochures. So, we are soliciting students of science and psychology to engage in a particular paradigm or way of thinking about the world, and so on. Psychology has more introductory courses and textbooks in methodology than any of the natural sciences. So again, we show you what to do, we show you how to do it, we show you how to set up an experiment, but we don't really spend a whole lot of time talking about, well, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? What are the pros and cons of doing it this way? What are you investigating anyway? What is the nature of this entity? What is the ontological status of this entity that you're investigating? And so knowingly or unknowingly, it presents the charms of scientific psychology without its empirical and conceptual ambiguities, without the arbitrariness of its definitions, and without mention of unresolved theoretical problems. Much scientific writing is rhetorical. I'm going to move along quickly there just in the interest of time. I apologize, but I want to try to get through this. So it's intended to persuade the reader to reinforce a preferred way of viewing the world and discourage alternatives. Just as an example, this is from Michael Billig. He says, anyone entering the academic world of the social sciences should be prepared to fill their sentences with abstract nouns and empty them of people, whether real or hypothetical. Most social scientists, like fishes in water, do not notice what they're doing. They just keep swimming through the density of their own prose. So when we write up a research paper, they train us to do this, right? So we try to detach ourselves, speak as objectively as possible. We try to make it look like we're describing an object or a process or series of events over there. And we de-emphasize the fact that there are people doing things, and perhaps they have aims and goals and purposes, and the researcher or investigator themselves have aims and goals and purposes. So just as an example, this is a quote from a paper that I pulled up. No pain, no gain. Cost-benefit trade-off has been formalized in classical decision theory to account for how we choose whether to engage effort. However, how the brain decides when to have breaks in the course of effort production remains poorly understood. So we anthropomorphize and attribute a misplaced agency to the brain in suggesting that it decides. If we accept this language, we're more likely to conclude that the person is passive in the process and has little causal influence in deciding when and whether to have breaks. So a decision involves arguably possibilities that are in front of the individual, that they're cutting away. That's to decide means to cut away one possibility, to remove one possibility in favor of another. And it's arguably teleological agents like human beings that are capable of doing that. Brains are not capable of doing that. Now, it's fine to speak metaphorically as long as you're continually aware of the fact that you're engaging in metaphor. The problem is that we don't notice that we're doing that. So just an example of this, does anyone know the biologist or primatologist? I can't remember what he is. Robert Sapolsky? Anyone familiar with him? Anyway, I think he's a primatologist. He studies baboons. He's done a lot of work with baboons. Anyway, he's one of the most recent scientists who is coming forward and saying that free will is an illusion, and it's just epiphenomenal. It doesn't have any causal force, and blah blah blah, and everything's just reducible to material efficient causes. Well, what's interesting is when you listen to him talk, and he talks about the brain, he slips into this anthropomorphizing of the brain and saying, well, the brain decides and chooses and this and that, and it's like, I don't think you can do that. You can speak metaphorically as you do that, but so in other words, if you try to eliminate, self-aware consciousness and free will, it's going to inevitably pop up somewhere else because it arguably is a reality that we have to deal with. Yeah, and so I think we have an established use with that term, to make a decision, what it is to make a decision, and usually what we don't mean is some biological process or kind of event kind of happening over there, so to speak. Just another quick example, evolutionary psychologists who are studying human relationships among university students. The present study aimed to examine the role of attachment styles in mate selection preferences. So again, by describing human relationships in zoological terms, we are closer to accepting the preferred conclusion: human relationships are analogous to non-human animal mating, and that such relationships are primarily defined by biological needs and functions, that is, breeding. Now again, if your conclusion justifies this, interpretation, that's fine. But if you're using this kind of language all through your paper, again, you're kind of asserting something that has yet to be proven. I'm just going to skip over this stuff. So we can talk about, other aspects of conceptual communities in terms of we kind of find ourselves in these epistemic bubbles into a particular paradigm that is insulated from other modes of interpretation. So we just don't realize that there are other ways of understanding something, right? So my hope is that some of you through this course, you're like, wow, gosh, I didn't know that you could think about this stuff in this way. And hopefully that's enlightening or sparks you to kind of engage in some of your, preferred modes in a different way. And then echo chambers. Echo chambers is another effect of this, which is that we prefer our own kind of theory or model and enjoy having that kind of reinforced. There's a confirmation bias arguably kind of going on here. And so we trust members of our own conceptual community and are greatly suspicious or distrustful as it relates to anyone else outside of that. Just a quick note on, so Kuhn said essentially that normal science is dogmatic and it just is this way, and what happens is that there's data eventually that is not able to be interpreted through the lens of that paradigm, and so the paradigm undergoes this period of crisis, and so the paradigm loses favorability, and eventually another paradigm sort of emerges that's able to account for the data and blah, 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 and then that paradigm takes off, and that's just the way that it is. And that sort of works in a way, when we're talking about, biology and chemistry and physics and things like that, because there is kind of like the artifacts out there kind of in the world, it's different, I guess, than the kind of phenomena that we're trying to understand. So that can happen. Popper suggested that as scientists, we should try to be putting forth a conjecture, an argument, a hypothesis, and then make attempts to refute it, make attempts to falsify it. So the theory has to be falsifiable, first of all, right? And then, there's arguments and debates about, the contrast between Kuhn and Popper and which one is right. And I think the emphasis is that, well, they're both right. So Kuhn said, speaking as a historian, this is the way that science seems to work. It's very dogmatic. It's like you join a conceptual team, and it's very difficult to break away from that. So that's the way it works. Whereas Popper is more of an aspirational, regardless of the way that it is, this is what we should try to do. We should try to be open-minded. We should try to be critical, and so on. Okay? So that's going to bring us to time. We'll wrap up there, and we'll start in on the behaviorist stuff here next time.